Today, we're going to break down a recent Fox News broadcast that makes a pretty huge claim that modern liberalism is on its last legs. We'll get into how they use the really heated issue of voter ID to argue that a major American political ideology is basically in a terminal decline. Right from the jump, they hit you with this. This is the opening shot, and it frames their entire argument right from the get-go. So, this isn't just a simple critique they're making. It's being presented more like an obituary for a whole political movement. So, what's the big idea here? Well, their core argument is that modern liberalism is failing, and that it's on what they literally call political life support. They argue this isn't just happening in one or two places, but it's visible across some major pillars of American society. And they get specific. They claim that in the places where liberalism has the most control, in education, entertainment, journalism, and in big cities, it has, and these are their words, laid them to waste. Okay, so how do they even begin to back up such a broad claim? Well, the commentators start pointing to what they frame as very specific, very clear examples of government incompetence, from the local level all the way up to Congress. All right, so here's the evidence they put on the table. They talk about the failure to clear snow in New York City, and even in a place like Montgomery County, Maryland, which is one of the richest counties in the country. They also point to layoffs at the Washington Post as a failure of a major media institution. And then they use clips from congressional hearings to argue that prominent Democratic leaders are just plain ineffective. This is how they drive their point home about the media. They actually twist the Post's own famous slogan to argue that the newspaper's struggles are this big, public, and pretty much undeniable symptom of a wider ideological collapse. So after making these general claims about incompetence, the broadcast pivots to its most detailed argument, and that is the fiery debate over voter ID laws. This is presented as the central battleground where all these supposed failures really come into focus. The whole discussion really centers on this one piece of legislation they call the SAVE Act. The source uses all the controversy around this proposed law to frame the entire conflict over what they call election integrity. Now, according to the broadcast, the two parties frame this whole thing in completely opposite terms. They say the Democratic position is to call the act an abomination and Jim Crow 2.0, while they paint the Republican view as just simple common sense to, prevent cheating and make sure elections are honest. To push back against the charge of racism, the commentators bring up polling data. They argue that voter ID is actually super popular, not just with white Americans, but with 82% of Latino Americans and 76% of Black Americans too. And here's their big claim. They allege that the opposition isn't really about racism at all. Instead, they say the real fear for Democrats is having oversight, which they argue would totally disrupt their political strategies. Then, the panel on the broadcast throws down a challenge. They claim that in the entire decade this debate has been going on, opponents of voter ID have never been able to show them a single, real person who was actually prevented from voting just because they didn't have an ID. And this is where they do something really interesting. They take that accusation of racism and they flip it. They turn it back on their opponents, accusing them of what they call the soft racism of lowered expectations. So what does that even mean? Well, they define it by arguing that the truly bigoted position is to believe that minority groups are somehow not capable of getting a photo ID, which is something you need for all sorts of things in daily life. One panelist, Tyrus, really hammers this point home with this quote. He frames the argument against voter ID as totally absurd and frankly insulting to Black Americans, suggesting it's just completely out of touch with reality. So you might be asking, if it's not about racism, what is it about? Well, the broadcast lays out this theory they call vote harvesting. They allege there's this systematic process of targeting specific groups, busing them to the polls, and then telling them who to vote for so they can cast ballots as one big block. And that's the practice they claim voter ID would stop. All right, so all of this, the incompetence, the voter ID debate, it all leads to the broadcast's final concluding argument. They tie it all back to their opening thesis, that this is all just evidence of a political movement that has lost its way and is for all intents and purposes dead. The commentators draw a really clear line in the sand. They argue that the kind of respectable liberalism of the past, the kind represented by the Kennedys and the Clintons, has been totally replaced by what they just dismiss as woke drivel that no intelligent person can take seriously. And who's to blame for this supposed death of a movement? You might think they'd point the finger at conservatives or populists, but nope.
According to them, the movement was killed from the inside by its own progressive wing. This final quote really ties it all together for them. It connects all the dots, the claims about incompetent cities, the chaotic hearings, the policy debates, to deliver their final verdict. The movement has failed, and it's over.
So after breaking down this entire argument from this one source, we're kind of left with a bigger question, aren't we? It's pretty clear that how an issue is framed, whether it's called a death rattle or Jim Crow 2.0, has a huge impact on how we understand it. So the real question for us to think about is, how does this kind of media framing shape our own perceptions of these really complex debates?